Okay, so let's get started today. Want to cover two topics today. So one is finishing up with session management, and then I want to get into PHP's interaction with basically files and databases. And when we finished last time, I guess I had gone quickly through PHP session management protocol, which involves the use of the session start command. And I received a couple questions in office hours yesterday about when it's appropriate to use session start. And the answer is in all PHP scripts which deal with the same session. The first time you call session start, so the first script that gets executed and executes session start, then session start will generate a session ID and an array, and it will associate that with $_session. Your subsequent calls to session start by other scripts will cause session start to retrieve this session array for you based on the session ID that was generated. So essentially, when you're doing session management, you want all of your files or all of your scripts to start with session start if you're using that technique for doing session management. Okay? And anything you store into the session table then will carry over to the next script that executes. Jay.
There's not necessarily any guarantee which script will technically be called first.
Sure. So Jay has a good point too. You also, the reason for using session start is there's no guarantee which script will execute first. This isn't like a C program where the entry point is only through main. The entry point could be through multiple links on that initial HTML page. So you can't even predict in advance which script will be executed first. So that's another reason for having session start at the beginning of your script. Now I'm also seemingly getting a lot of questions about homework 8 and what should be done on what pages or how to use session start. I have 3 files available to you. They're world readable that you can look at and that are an outstanding guide to how to do homework 8. So they take you through a session with a pizza thing, and if we have a look, I guess I'm going to have to enter it. Okay, so it starts out, asks you to pick your toppings, your favorite color. Okay, so I send the form, it comes back with some information, and then you press to reconfirm and it comes up with some other stuff. So it shows you how you can walk through a couple pages and do things. And while, yes, if you simply execute them, you're not going to see what's happening because, again, a PHP script is essentially, it's like a function that's taking some form data from the user and whose return value is a web page. So if you just look at the page source trying to figure out what this PHP file looks like, it's not going to do you any good because you're going to see the output from the PHP script. So this really does you no good. But you can log in to the Hydra machine and you can look at these. Okay, so if you just go to web home, my web home, CGI bin, you can look at it. There's pizza session.php, and it's got a good example of how to use session start, how to get access to the form data that was sent, how to generate another HTML page. So it really has a great template to follow for homework 8. So I would strongly urge you to have a look at that if you're having difficulties with homework 8.
So when you said like the session to the Git array,
Mm-hmm.
I saw somebody online who did session is plus equal to the whole Git array. The whole session array is plus equal to the Git array. Do you think what do you think about that? It works.
I've never seen it, so.
But then you wouldn't like have to individually like you would just bring over the whole Git array into the session array.
I guess I'd have to think about it. It doesn't seem, first blush, it doesn't seem unreasonable. I'd probably have to think about security issues. I'm not really good on security, so.
You want to introduce invalidated data into your session variable.
Right. Jay's saying, do you want to introduce unvalidated information into your session variable? But, I mean, you can check it just as easily in the session variable then as you can in the get array. So it's really just, I think what Ardlin is saying is there a difference between doing a whole bunch of individual assignment statements and one big massive assignment. Off the top of my head, Ardlin, I don't see an issue other than there could be some previous setting in session that does get overwritten because there might be a key in get that you didn't anticipate and it overwrites some key in session that you didn't anticipate getting overwritten, so you accidentally lose. That's the only
Because they can add,
issue. Right. I
they
mean,
can add things in there that you did not.
right. Yeah, they can add in things you don't expect. So I guess there is some danger to doing that, but it's not going to be an issue for this homework assignment, but probably is something to be a bit wary about doing in practice. Okay. I guess the whole thing comes down, unfortunately, to security, security, security. It seems these days it's just, you have to unfortunately worry a lot about it. Okay. One thing I don't really want is, I also saw a couple people who'd gone and were trying to pull stuff off of the web for things like menus, and it was stuff that was super complicated as opposed to just going to the notes on my how to create XHTML forms. I'm not asking you to do stuff on the homework that's not in the notes, that I haven't covered, okay? So I don't want you going to the internet and pulling in these really crazy ways like jQuery ways to do stuff. I want you to use the stuff that's in the notes. And part of the reason is because I think it's important that you understand the so-called assembly language of the web, okay? So a lot of what I'm teaching you is what would be considered assembly language these days. There are editors that create HTML documents where you specify widgets in those editors and they generate the underlying HTML code for you, and you'll never have to create your own .html file from scratch, perhaps. But it's just like it's useful to know assembly language code because it tells you how a machine operates. It also is very good to know how to generate native HTML code, not just because it's nice to know how jQuery is working or how those top-end things are producing it, but sometimes you actually have to modify HTML files. So Blackboard's a good example of that. Blackboard constantly is messing up the formatting of the stuff I enter because, like bullet points in Blackboard, it doesn't know when I no longer want a bullet point, or it doesn't know when I want a new paragraph within a bullet point. When I hit return, it says, oh, you want a new bullet point, and no matter what I do, I can't stop it from creating a new bullet point because the IDE is too limited. Fortunately, Blackboard gives me a way to drop into the native HTML where I'm able to get it to do what I want it to do. So in fact, my knowing how to do native HTML does help me with a number of the IDE tools that are embedded in some of the university's learning management systems. Okay, so that's also why I don't want you going to the internet and pulling in funky stuff. I want you using my notes. Yes, question?
On the homework,
Mm-hmm.
so when the user reaches the confirmation page, are we supposed to allow them to go back and change it?
No, too complicated. Just show it and highlight it.
Just show it and then
Yep, that's all I want you to do. Yep, you don't have to generate a new form. In the real world, yes, you would have to generate a form, but I'm not asking you to do that, okay? It's more that I'm trying to get you, I mean, you already created forms on the first 2 pages. I'm not trying to force you to do it. It's at some point I've hit you over the head enough with the hammer and we move on to some other topic. Okay, other questions? Okay, so the issue, as we talked about last time with PHP session management, is that it only works with a single server. And in practice, so it works really well for me when I'm dealing with Code Assessor because I'm only working with one server. But if you're at Amazon or if you're at eBay, you're not having the same server always interact with the user. The user's interaction is being handled by multiple servers. So the fourth technique that we talked about for session management was the use of databases. Okay, so the fourth one was the use of databases. And basically, you use some type of unique session ID. It can very well be the one that it can't be necessarily the one that's generated by, actually I'd never thought about this before until now. You have to have a way of sharing, oh, I know how it's done. Okay, so you actually use the unique session ID that's generated by PHP, and you try to ship that via a cookie to the, or perhaps via a hidden form element, to the script, to the user's page, and then that unique ID will be shipped back, and you can use that as an identifying key into the database. So you use a unique session ID as your key for accessing info in the database. Okay, and you can either use a cookie or a hidden form element to transmit the session ID to the client, and they will then transmit it back. And again, even though, of course, a hacker could tamper with the session ID, it's unlikely to do them any good because it's just, as I told you last time, it's like trying to find a needle in the haystack. They'd probably be just as likely to hit upon the right way to decrypt a public key as they would be to hit upon a legitimate session ID for someone else. So you really don't care if someone gets in there and modifies the session ID, because really all it's going to do is stop the user from being able to get their own session information. Now obviously you don't want a hacker constantly disrupting your user from getting access to your site, but you don't have to worry about the user messing around with it. And this works well because now any server, so the advantage is is that information is on the server, so more secure, not obviously completely secure, but more secure against attack than on the client. Okay, you save bandwidth. Okay, reduce network traffic with the client. Okay, it works with multiple servers. Okay, I guess then the disadvantages is that it's going to be slower because it's going to be held on a file system, so slower to access. So the BC is because. So a single server might cache the session information, or at least some of it, so you might be able to get faster access than having to go through a file system. And you have to do the application programmer has to manage the session, has to do more session management, unless there is some kind of framework that the application programmer is working through. So now the application programmer has to be aware of the database, has to be aware of querying it, has to be aware of when the session is ending, and hence the information can be deleted from the database. It's like having pointers. You have to do a lot more management with pointers, and also deletion to avoid memory leaks. Whereas PHP Session Manager is more like garbage collection because it's automatically collecting the session management information and discarding it when you're done with it. But I'm sure, I don't know how Amazon or eBay handles it. I'm sure though that they have some kind of framework that makes this seamless, session management software that makes it seamless. I'm sure that the application programmer is not dealing with the session management explicitly. Okay, but just a quick review. There's 4 ways to do. Remember, the big problem with web programming is the impermanence of temporary variables. The fact that you lose state information each time a script finishes executing. And unfortunately, you would actually like to keep that temporary information alive between interactions with the user. And the way that is handled is with a term called session management. And there's 4 ways to do it. 2 on the client using cookies or hidden form elements. 2 on the server side, at least in PHP, involving PHP session management, which works on a single server, or your own handcrafted session management using a database, which is also a server-side solution. Okay? So, we good with that? Okay. So then moving on, we have kind of 2 big ways that, so we dealt with web programming, we were I was talking about how I'm dealing with my interactions with the client. Now I'm turning my attention to how PHP has interactions with file systems. Okay, so PHP's, I'm going to call it PHP's interaction with file systems. Okay. If you have unstructured data like you deal with a lot in the undergraduate courses here, that's one thing. It's the interaction is pretty comparable to what you deal with in your undergraduate classes, and I showed you a few handy functions like file, get contents, file, print or write contents that will dump strings to a file or read strings from a file. But normally you're dealing with somewhat more structured data, and there's two types of structured data. You may either be dealing with a database or you may be dealing with XML, are two big ways to structure data. Okay, so we'll start by talking about databases and then we'll talk about XML. And we're just going to talk about how PHP interacts with an SQL database. It basically has, let me go to the notes. So PHP has two packages that you can use. One is the MySQLi extension, and you will see older code that uses just MySQL without the I extension. That previous package was deprecated in 2012, so you generally want to try to change that code if you can to use the MySQLi library. And it's a procedural library for dealing with databases. There's also something called PDO, PHP Data Objects, which is an object-oriented way of dealing with a database. And it works with databases that are other than MySQL. So it allows PHP to attach to other databases. In this class, we're only going to deal with the MySQLi library, part because we have a MySQL server here. And there's just actually a very few small set of commands for dealing with an SQL database. So to connect, you know how in SQL you have to log in. You do that login in a single step with a PHP script. So you give it all 4 pieces of information, including the password, which always feels very icky to me. But there's no way really around it. You just got to try to make sure that file is well protected and people can't get access to it. And if it succeeds, you've given the right username, the right password, the right server name, and the right database name, and it's able to make the connection, it returns a resource called an SQL_link. That's the type. And you can use that link, in effect, as a ticket for identifying all subsequent calls to a database, because sometimes you need to deal with multiple databases. If you're just dealing with one database, you don't have to deal with this link identifier, because when you omit it from an SQL command, then the SQL or the PHP assumes you want to deal with the last database that you were dealt with. So here's an example of my connecting to my 2014 database. Obviously not quite the same this semester. And then, as all good file handling things, you should close your connection when you're done dealing with the server, and it returns true to indicate the close succeeded and false to indicate it failed. Then to execute a query, it's just MySQLi query. You give it your SQL link that you got from the command. If you just give it a string query, it will use the previous link, the last link that you were given. And then string query is just any SQL syntax that works with MySQL. And it returns a resource object if the query succeeds, and false, the query fails for any reason, maybe due to a syntax error, maybe you don't have permission for that particular operation, any number of reasons it returns false. This is where dynamic typing is helpful because the value is a resource if it's true, and it's a false or Boolean if it fails. And you can look at then the result from the queries. The biggest for your selection queries, it may come back as a number of rows. So my SQLi fetch array will fetch the next unread row. Just a sec, Greg. Will fetch the next unread row from the result and put it into an associative array where the keys in the associative array are the names associated with the columns in the query. And if you did something like select, say, sum x as, say, score, then you can access that column with the key score. And you can also access the results using indexing, using numeric indices. So the first column will be 0, the second column will be 1, and so on. That's considered dangerous to use numeric indexing because if you change the query, so let's say you have select sum as score and you get the result out using 0, and then someone changes the query so it's select grade, comma, sum x as score, then your numeric indexing will break because it will now get grade rather than score. Whereas if you used it in an associative fashion, you will still get score. And generally, you're unlikely to change the name of the columns. So generally, it's considered safer to use it as an associative array. So as an example, we perform our query, select star from person, and now the star means the column names will come back as they were named in the relation, and now I simply iterate through the resource that's been returned. When it runs out of rows, it will return false, but otherwise it assigns an associative array to $row, which then accesses the first and last name. And you can, with an update or a delete or an insert, you can determine how well your query did by querying MySQLi affected rows. That will say how many rows were affected, whereas MySQLi num rows will return the number of rows retrieved by a select query. That's basically it. Those commands are pretty much adequate for dealing with it. Just like Greg had his hand up first. The same, what you were using for your CS465. So when you submit it, post that to Piazza and ask Ryan, okay? Because he's going to know whether he's going to ask that you delete. I don't know what he's going to do, to be honest, okay? So I'd rather he tell you because make it easy on him. Yeah, I understand. You probably don't want him knowing the password to your database. Conversely, he probably doesn't want to be running code on his database where he doesn't necessarily know what you're doing to it. So I will he's going to make the call. Okay, Jay.
Are there built-in functions for managing transactions?
I don't know if there are or aren't. Simply because I don't do transaction processing.
I mean, I figure with the updating stuff, if something goes wrong, when
It seems like they should have ways to deal with transaction processing, but in general, I'm not familiar with how transaction processing is done in SQL, so I could imagine that it might be that you just do it through. Right, so I'm thinking you might actually, that MySQLi query might actually be sufficient for doing transaction management. Or it might be that there's, right, so I just don't know.
they'll return you a handle so you can roll back after so many.
Yep. So then there's something else. Any questions about that? That's what I want you to use in this class, okay? The MySQLi library. That's what you should use for homework 9. There is something else that's considered safer, which are prepared SQL statements. And a prepared SQL statement is a template that contains parameters, and it's compiled and optimized once and then can be reused many times. So it's a bit like a function. And the best way to show you an SQL prepared statement is just an example. So here's one where I'm creating a prepared statement that selects district from city where name equals, and you can see the question mark. So the question mark is a parameter. So any place where there's a question mark in the query, that's considered a parameter. So the prepare statement will compile and optimize this query to the extent possible, and it returns some kind of object that you can then use for that query. Then you can bind parameters to the question marks with the bind param statement. So you give it the prepared query. This is a string telling SQL or PHP what the types of the parameters are. So S is string, I is integer, D is double, B is blob, pretty much anything else. And then you have a list of the parameters. So this is a type string. This is a list of parameters, so kind of reminiscent of printf. And actually, what you are giving it, in some sense, is references to these variables. So it is actually at this point, anytime you call the execute statement right here, it is pulling the values from those variables. And if you execute the statement a second time, it will again pull the values from those variables. So when you call bind param, it's not actually taking the values at the time that the statement is executed. It's delayed. It's like delayed binding, where the execute statement retrieves the values from the bound variables. So for example, if right here I say $city equals Knoxville, what we'll execute is a query for Knoxville, not a query for Amersfoort. Even though when this was bound, the value of city was Amersfoort, what actually it will get is Knoxville. So I call that delayed binding. Okay, so you just change the names of the, you just keep making new assignments to your variables and re-executing the query. Works really well for things like insert statements or update statements. Okay, and then to get the result, there's a bind result and the list of variables to which the column should be bound. And then fetch will fetch a row at a time. And it will, so fetch a row at a time. And store columns, store column values into the bound variables. And it will return false when there's no rows left. And then when you're finally finished with a prepared statement, again, so you don't have a memory leak, try to close it. Let the PHP know you no longer need it. And there's a number of advantages, so questions about this. I don't expect you to use this in homework 9. I expect you to be, however, aware of it for a multiple choice question on an exam. Okay. There is also a object-oriented way to do it, and I gave you a link to that. Again, we're using procedural in this course, so I only went over the procedural. So there's a number of advantages to prepared statements. One is that you parse and optimize them once rather than multiple times. So if you have 100 insert statements like you had in the first couple of homeworks or like you have in the projects, a prepared statement would only have to parse and optimize the insert statement once as opposed to 100 times, so obviously there's a time savings there. 2, you minimize network traffic because you only transmit the body of the query once, and thereafter you're only transmitting the parameter values. So obviously there's less traffic going, or less bandwidth that you're consuming. And finally, it helps prevent SQL injection attacks, especially with careless programmers, because it's now very clear to the optimizer what are your parameters and what is part of the query. So you'll remember last time I was talking about a statement that looked like X equals Brad, and the fact that if I wasn't careful and I tried to insert this string into a database, doing something like update, blah, 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 set something, set code equals, and maybe this is $X, and this is surrounded by quotes. The problem is this quote may prematurely terminate something. So if I'm not careful, I could get an injection attack where a hacker takes advantage of that. But if the prepared statement is simply set code equal question mark, now the injection attack would fail because it would know that this is the string that it's trying to insert, and there would be no ambiguity as to whether I meant to terminate the query with this quote or not. It would be obvious that I did not mean to. It's just part of the parameter. So prepared statements also help prevent or guard against SQL injection attacks. Obviously, not a fail-safe method, but certainly help. So, questions about prepared SQL statements or about PHP's interface to an SQL database? Okay. I don't think you'll really have much trouble with it. It's really, I found to be quite simple to use. Okay, so there is a second form of dealing with data. So this is highly structured data, but sometimes you want to deal with data that is called semi-structured. And certainly object-oriented databases are an attempt to deal with semi-structured data. There's another standard called XML that is also meant to deal with semi-structured data. So XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. And the idea is that you can define your own tags to identify content. The easiest way is probably just to show you an example. So here's a very simple example. So we have the tag letter, and then within letter it has three components, a to, a from, and a message. You'll notice that all of the tags are terminated by a similar tag that has a slash, so that allows the XML interpreter to know where the content begins and ends. It allows also someone using your XML file to interpret the content. So if I said Happy Mother's Day, if I just had Mom, Tom, Happy Mother's Day, you wouldn't be able to interpret what parts of the message each of those three items were meant for. So you can use arbitrary tags with XML to define or mark up your content. And that's the basic idea. And just like HTML, you have a root tag, and then you may have either nested tags like I have here, or you can have a tag that in effect is a leaf node, in which case it will have text of some type embedded in it. So an XML file, when parsed, actually can be parsed into a nice tree. In this case, it would be letter, which goes to, from, and message. And then this is Mom, Tom, and happy, blah, blah, blah. So every XML file can be parsed into a tree that looks like this as long as you follow the rules. And of course, if you don't follow the rules, the XML parser will give you an error message. We'll go through the rules for XML files shortly. It's fairly simple. Okay, the typical extension for an XML file is .xml. They are stored as plain text. So they consume a lot more storage than a database because a database tends to encode stuff in binary. Okay, another reason that, can someone suggest another reason why an XML file is going to take up more space than a database? Not just plain text, there's some additional information we have to store. Tags, very good. So in a database, we don't store tags because we know what the columns are in advance. We've used a DDL to say this is a relation, and maybe the letter relation would have the columns to, from, and message. So in a database, we would only store the data. But in an XML file, we also store the tags, which are called metadata, because they describe the data. Letter, to, from, and message are metadata because they're describing the data. They're giving a way of interpreting it. Okay? The fact that it's semi-structured also gives us more flexibility. So here's an example of an address book with some contacts. So here's an address, street address 2400 Craighead Lane. You'll notice here's a different type of address for Mickey Mouse. Okay, has nice dwelling at the Penthouse Suites, because after all, Mickey is our franchise. Any rate, we call it semi-structured for this reason. So we have both of the contacts have an address tag, but they're not the same. They don't contain the same information. So it's semi-structured. Their structure is there, but it's not rigid the way it is in a database. And the tags provide a way to interpret the different structures. So with Brad Vanderzanden, you say, oh, 2400 Craighead Lane, that's a street because it's embedded in a street tag. Whereas you know that Walt Disney Penthouse Suites is an apartment name because it's embedded in an apartment name tag. So XML gives you more flexibility in the ways you structure your data. It doesn't require that it all be structured the same way. Okay, and there are some guidelines for structuring the data, which is basically make the data as fine-grained as possible. Okay, and that's because someone reading your data may have trouble interpreting it if it's too coarse-grained. Okay, prime example is my name, which computers are constantly butchering. Okay, a lot of them seem to think that Vander is my middle name, which is annoying. Some of them simply don't know what to do with Zanden, so they make my name be Brad Vander. Okay, I've had my last name is Zanden with my first name is Brad Vander. Okay, the point is, if I just give you name and a computer is looking at it, that's highly ambiguous as to what each of those three values are. Whereas here, it's now very clear. Brad is my first name, Vanderzanden is my last name, and there's no middle name in that particular string. So that's why you make your data fine-grained so that you're not leaving ambiguous information. Oftentimes, a program wants to break that string or that data into smaller parts, and if it can be broken into smaller parts, you should do that and mark it up. Okay. So questions about the basics of XML. That's kind of the basics of XML right there, that it uses markup tags to structure the data. It's stored in a plain text file. It is read by an interpreter, and we'll get to that. PHP has 3 XML interpreters that will parse the file and most of the time generate a tree. One of the interpreters does not, because sometimes the file is too big to fit in memory, in which case you can't do it that way. But if it's big enough to fit in memory, you'll use a parser that will parse it into a tree. And then there's usually some tools that you can use for traversing the tree. In fact, we go back for a moment to my first set of notes on XML. So it was already there. Let's see. So not only do you have a tool called an XML document, but there's a couple other things you can do. So you can define effectively type declarations for your tags. So you can either leave the tags be uninterpreted, or you can provide one of these two additional documents. One is called a document type definition file. The other is called a schema file. And they will describe the formatting and content of the tags. The schema is a lot more powerful because you can actually ascribe types to your data, such as saying that a salary is a floating point number with 5, say 7 digits and 2 digits of precision, or you could give a regular expression for defining the type of a date. Whereas a DDT was much more primitive. It was the first way of describing the tags. and it actually only allowed you to describe the structure. For example, you could say that a letter needed to consist of a to, a from, and a message tag, and they had to be in that order, but you couldn't specify the type of the content. So with the document type definition, you could specify structure, but you couldn't describe the type information for the content. And then XSLT, standing for Extensible Style Sheet, and CSS can be used to turn an XML document into a PDF file, into an HTML file, into a raw text, something that can be more easily viewed. Normally, you just want to view it as an XML file, but sometimes you might want to be able to print it out in a nice format or something, so they have these style sheets, transformation language that lets you do it. We'll not talk about it in this class. But those are two tools for dealing with an XML file. The schemas are actually quite handy for defining the type information in a file, because you can hand that schema to a parser and it will actually type check the file as it's read in, the XML file as it's read in. So you know how irritating it is to do all that type checking on a file yourself. With a schema description of the file, the parser will do it for you. So if there's any errors in the file, the parser will print out error information. So you can assume that if the file gets parsed, the data is valid. So that's actually a real advantage of using a schema to define the type information in your file. Unfortunately, schemas are very verbose, and I have a whole document about it, and I finally this year decided it's just too much for this class. So I'm going to just show you the thing quickly and then move on. But I used to have a scripting languages course where I'd spend about 2 weeks on XML going over schemas and DDTs and parsers, because there is a lot you can do with XML. Unfortunately, we don't have time to pursue it in depth. Okay, so there is structure of an XML file. The basic thing is what they call elements. Those are your tags. And as I said, a tag can consist either of subtags, or it can contain text, or it can contain both. It's kind of rare for it to contain both. It usually is either an internal node that contains a set of children nodes or elements, or it's a leaf that consists of some type of text. Then you're allowed to attach attributes to your tags. So for example, here ID equals 1. Generally frowned upon because parsers aren't required to present that attribute information to you. But sometimes the attributes are handy for providing more meta information. Certainly they're often used in HTML. So for example, in HTML, an image tag, one of the attributes is the source. It actually gives a URL for the image, and that's required in order to pull the file in. So certainly attributes sometimes can contain important information. Okay, and then I said before that there are certain rules for a well-formed XML file. They're pretty simple, but you need to follow them. Every tag is terminated by a / tag of the same name. Okay, if sometimes a tag, this wasn't a good example because you always would want to presumably provide an example of gender, but there are certain tags that are only supposed to convey certain information. For example, the XHTML tag BR/ is a hard line break. HR creates a horizontal rule in a HTML document. So those are example of tags that don't have content but still have meaning. So if you have a tag like that in an XML file, you only have to write it like that, and that both starts and terminates the tag. So if you ever see something that looks like that, that's what's going on. Then the tags are properly nested, so you can't have, for example, letter, say 2, \letter, \2, because that's not properly nested. The 2 must be terminated. If the 2 is opened, nested inside of letter, then 2 must be terminated before letter is terminated. So that's what's called proper nesting. Okay, there's a single top-level root element. So you can't have 2 top-level tags in the same file. Remember with address book, it had multiple contacts, but there was then a tag above it called address book. That was the root element for that file. And then you also need to start the file with a declaration that indicates the version number so that a parser knows how to parse that file based on the version number. So it starts, what's it look like? That island. There's other syntax you've seen that looks a little like that for starting something, like recently. PHP, except now it's XML. PHP also starts with a less than and a question mark. But this is now an XML document, so it starts the same way, but then with XML. Okay, and this is like an attribute. Okay, attribute values are enclosed in quotes, and tags are case sensitive. Those 6 rules, very simple, but keeps everything nice. So questions about that? Okay, so if you care, as I said, I have a whole bunch of things on about describing schemas and DDTs. As I said, DDTs specify the structure of a document, used primarily with files that involve text, like that letter file. They only allow you, though, to specify things like the order in which tag elements appear or what tag elements should appear within another tag. They're not even good for being able to specify an exact number that could appear. So for example, you might have dependents. You might want to be able to say that there are between 0 and 10 dependents. You can't even do that. You can say that with the DDT that a tag appears once, or it can appear 0 or many times with an asterisk, or 1 or many times with a plus. You can't even hold it to a specific number. Where schemas are really good for specifying type information, structure, number of times things can appear. However, schemas appear to have been designed for business programmers. Very verbose. Painful to write a schema file because of its verbosity. Okay, but it can be used with the validator, which will type check the file, hence you don't have to do it in your own program. Okay, I'm not going to go through everything. I'll just give you, can I even give you a taste? There we go. So here's a taste of a schema. So you're defining a type element, name is last name, declaring its type to be a string. Here I'm declaring age, type is an integer. Or if I want to have a compound type, here we have a restriction. We're restricting the age to be between 0 and 120. Let's see. So here's one where we're defining a book type, and we're saying it's a sequence now, saying that it must appear in exactly this order: title, author, publisher, price, ESPN. So it just gives you an idea of kind of what a schema file looks like in terms of defining tags and type information and the like. I won't hold you responsible for it on an exam. I will hold you responsible for knowing that schema and DTT files specify the structure of an XML file and allow for the interpretation of the tags. What I will hold you responsible for is knowing about the parsers. So PHP provides 3 types of parsers. So PHP there are 3 of them. There's the expat, there's the simple, and there's the DOM parser. And each of them has advantages and disadvantages. The simple and the DOM produce a tree that you can manipulate. They work when the file is big enough to fit in memory. The expat parser does not produce a tree and basically is only used when the file is too big to fit in memory. So used when the file is too big to fit in memory. And instead of producing a tree, it produces a stream of, in effect, tokens. And they can be at one of 2 starts. 3 types: a start tag, a content, or an end tag. So basically, it's calling functions that you provide it with, and it says this is a start tag, or this is a content string, or this is an end tag. And you have to deal with then interpreting the content. So for example, you normally end up using a stack to keep track of where you are in the document. So you'd like with a letter, you would probably take the letter tag, then you would get the to, and you would put it, then you would get Mary, or mom actually. And the only way to be able to interpret mom would be to go and look at the top of your stack to know that, oh, that top of the stack is a to tag, hence the content should be interpreted as to. The next thing you would get would be an end to, so you would pop the to off the top. It's very tedious, but it works if the file is too big to fit in memory. Okay, the simple is the Goldilocks solution. It's the most recent of the 3 parsers, and I call it the 80-20 rule parser, which means that with 20% of the functionality, you get 80% of what you need. So it doesn't support everything. You can't manipulate the structure of a XML document with the simple parser. You can only read the document and change content. So allows you to read a document, read content of a document, okay, and to change content. But you can't change the structure. So for example, I could change in the letter, I could change who the letter is to. I could change it from mom to dad, but I could not change the to tag to be, say, a BCC tag, or I could not add a CC tag to the document. So that's a limitation of the simple parser. However, as we'll see, the simple parser gives you a lot of functions that allow you to easily navigate the tree. The DOM parser is the most general. So it gives you the remaining 80% of functionality, which you only need 20% of the time. Okay? So allows you to modify both content and structure. But it has very general functions for manipulating the tree, which aren't as easy to remember as the one for simple, nor are they as easy to read. So in general, you try to use the simple parser if at all possible, falling back to either the XPath or DOM parser if the simple parser doesn't have what you need. Okay. So, quick look at each of them. The way you create an instance of a XPath parser is with the XML parser create command in PHP, and that returns an object that you can then use to parse an XML file. Then you need to provide a function. You write a function that takes a, remember I said it gives you 3 tokens. 1 start tokens or start tags, 2 content information, and 3 stop tags. So you have to write 3 functions, 1 to handle the start tags, 1 to handle the stop tags, and 1 to handle the content. So the one that handles the start tags, you take an instance of the parser. This is the name of the tag as a string, and this is an associative array of attributes associated with that element. Okay, then the one for terminating, the function that handles terminating tags, it only needs to know that the name of the terminating tag. Okay, and it will strip the /. So the start tag might be catalog. Okay, you get that as a string for start element. For end element, you would get catalog also as your parameter. You don't have to name these functions start element and end element. You can name them anything you want. What is important is the number of parameters. And finally, you have a function for handling the content. Again, the pointer to the instance of the parser and the string representing the data content. Then you actually associate these functions with the handlers. So there's 2 commands. The set element handler, or essentially it's the set tag handler. You provide the string names of the 2 functions you created to handle your start and stop tags. And the set character data handler is where you provide the name of the function that wants to handle the content of the data. And again, typically these 2 functions, they simply push and pop tag names from a stack. And they might need to store the attribute array if necessary. And then this will interpret content according to the top tag on the stack. Now, of course, sometimes it will do more than push or pop. If it's starting, for example, a letter, maybe you would create an object called letter. Thus, you could then start inserting information into it. So you might do more than just push or pop tag names from a stack. You might also start creating some objects there. Okay, then here's an example. So fopen test.xml. So I'm having to treat the file as a regular file. I have to read it in chunks. The only reason I use an expat parser is because the file is too big to fit into memory. So basically, I'm going to read the file in chunks that are manageable that can fit into memory. Then you can see that I parse it. And when the parser is called, it will call those function handlers that you wrote, and the statement returns once the entire string of 4096 bytes have been parsed, or what it can parse out of it, and it will save any part that it can't parse and continue from there. And then at the end we free it. So it's not a particularly friendly parser to use, but useful to know that it's there and how to operate it. We will talk about the details of the simple XML parser and the DOM parser on Tuesday. Once we're done with that, we'll start into the final scripting language of the course, which is JavaScript. So have a good weekend, and I will see you